Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted and honored to welcome Professor Olav Sorenson, Joseph Jacobs Chair in Entrepreneurial Studies, Professor of Strategy and Faculty Director of the Price Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at UCLA Anderson School of Management as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Professor Sorenson's primary research focuses on economic geography, exploring how entrepreneurship shapes regional growth and competitiveness, and why some regions are more supportive of entrepreneurs than others. Reflecting on his journey, he shares, I was in graduate school in the mid 90s at Stanford in Silicon Valley, and it seemed like everybody and their brother was getting involved in a startup. That's really what got me interested in entrepreneurship and in asking why Silicon Valley, what made it different from other places. He has highlighted the unexpected consequences of social capital's critical role in entrepreneurial success. In recognition of his groundbreaking research, Professor Sorensen was honored with the 2018 Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research. Professor Olev has delivered nearly 400 research presentations and has published over 100 papers on entrepreneurship, economic geography, and innovation. His work has appeared in leading journals such as Science, the American Journal of Sociology, the Journal of Financial Economics, the Review of Economic and Statistics, Administrative Science Quarterly, Strategic Management Journal, and Research Policy. In addition to his research contributions, Professor Sorensen serves as a department editor for management science and has held editorial positions at more than a dozen other prestigious journals. Beyond his research and teaching responsibilities, Professor Sorenson serves as a faculty research director at the Harold and Pauline Price Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. In this role, he aims to enhance the Price Center's curriculum while establishing dedicated research division for entrepreneurial studies. Additionally, he is committed to mentoring students, entrepreneurial teams, supporting both the Anderson Venture Accelerator and participants in the school's business creation option field study. From 1999 to 2005, Professor Olav Sorenson taught strategy courses at UCLA Anderson. Before returning to Anderson, he held a Frederick Frank 54 and Mary Seth Tanner professorship at the Yale School of Management and previously served as the Jeffrey S. Skoll Chair in Technical Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of Toronto. Throughout his career, Professor Sorenson has been a faculty member at London Business School and the University of Chicago and has visiting appointments at institutions including the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, SDA Bocconi, Universiade Carlos III, Melbourne Business School, Singapore Management University, the National University of Singapore, BI Nordvigen Business School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and INSEAD. Professor Sorensen earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard University and his master's and PhD from Stanford University. He has also been awarded an honorary doctorate from Aalborg University. In this episode, Professor Olav Sorensen will share insights from his research on the causal inference problem, when can managers use data to inform decisions, and how can organization design help them. So further, without delay, let's welcome Professor Olav Sorensen to the podcast. Professor Sorensen, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Professor, why is distinguishing correlation from causation so challenging in both scientific research and corporate decision making?
Yeah, so there's we've probably all heard this moniker that correlation does not equal causation, and one of the reasons that it's really hard to tell between the two is that a lot of times we don't have information about everything that's happening in the world, and so it's very hard to know whether some of the things that we see that seem to be related are actually one thing causing another, or if it's really just that they're both maybe dependent on some third factor. So to give, kind of a classic example from the academic literature, we know that people that have more education tend to earn more money, right? And so you might think, well, if I go and, get more years of education, get additional degrees, that's going to translate into higher salary. But one of the open questions there is it really from the education, or is it that people who maybe are smarter, who have better executive function, are actually doing more education? And it's really those attributes of the individual that's leading to, sort of stronger earnings, better kind of careers than the education itself. And so this is, kind of a fundamental problem, I would say, not just in, business, but also in academia.
The replication crisis in social sciences and medicine has led to more rigorous research methodologies. Do you see a similar shift happening in business and management research?
Yeah, so I think absolutely it's happening in the academic side on business and management. We're now seeing much more, kind of concern, attention to trying to understand, like the education question, are the types of relationships that we see between business practices and business performance, are those causal relationships or are those just correlations? I think there's always like a time lag, right? I feel like some of these things sort of start maybe in economics or, in this case, I think you're right that some of this started also in, even the, kind of hard sciences kind of, moves over and then becomes prevalent in the academic research on business. And then the question is like, what's the lag until that really starts moving into business practice? And that could easily be another 15 to 20 years. But, we're starting to teach students in MBA programs, in undergraduate business programs, more about how to think about causal analysis and how to think about statistics. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that getting integrated, into business as well.
Professor, how do hidden variables such as personal behaviors, unforeseen external events, or corporate culture impact a manager's ability to predict the effects of their decisions?
Yeah, so one of the really hard things, and this kind of like the education example that I gave you is a good example of this. So the fundamental problem that we're trying to understand is something that we think is related to an outcome, is it actually related? So in that case, it's like education and earnings. And the thing that we're really worried about is what we might call a confounding common cause. So is there something that's both leading to the thing that we'd like to vary, in this case, education, and the thing that we hope is the outcome, right? In this case, earnings. If there's some sort of confounding common cause, those are the cases where it's really hard to determine whether or not it's a causal relationship or whether it's sort of a correlation where we just don't understand the whole system. The same types of things is happening when managers are, say, observing the behavior of an employee, and they see maybe like one of the examples that we give in the paper is, let's imagine that we see a car salesperson, right, giving a discount to certain customers, and then we see that discount actually seems to reduce sales of the car, which seems surprising. But then we think, well, maybe we should tell the salesperson that they should never discount anything. The problem is that there's probably a reason why this car salesperson is giving the discounts to the people they are, right? And it may be that those people who are unlikely to buy, right? They're kind of reluctant, and the salesperson maybe sees some cues from the individual that kind of cues them in on that. And so then they give the discount, hoping that make the difference. But even with that discount, maybe it doesn't. The manager doesn't see that whole interaction, right? So they don't understand, kind of what private information the salesperson might have. They're just looking at the discounting and the sales behavior and trying to maybe make some inferences about whether or not the discounting is actually useful for sales. But without that information, it's very hard for them to come to the right conclusion.
Can you share an example of a corporate decision where hidden factors lead to unexpected consequences?
Absolutely. And let me give you an example this is from a consulting project that I did many years ago. One of the things that's good about this example, there's lots of examples of companies doing things and kind of not having results be what they expected. But this is a good one because I was able to figure out why there was sort of a difference. So I was doing research for a company that offered pay-per-view movies in hotel rooms. And one of the things that they had discovered was that it seemed like some of the larger systems that they had been installing, so systems that had more movies available for customers to buy, were actually selling at lower rates, right? So they thought, well, they didn't really have a theory, but they thought, well, maybe we should be, having smaller systems. Those are actually cheaper for us to produce, and they seem to produce higher sales rates. So maybe those would both be cheaper, produce more revenue, so really much more profitable, right? So they did that for a little while, and what they discovered was that their sales went down even further in these kind of these new updated systems, and so they were kind of a little bit puzzled. Why is this happening, right? So that was kind of where I entered and started doing some research into, well, what was really producing this. And what they hadn't sort of taken into account, but turned out to be really important, is that the places where they had the bigger systems that offered more movies to customers were also larger hotels. And those larger hotels had other types of things available. So larger hotels tended to have, gyms, they had pools, they had restaurants, they had bars, they had all of these other amenities that people could consume. And it wasn't, so what it turns out is it wasn't that it was the larger system itself that was causing the lower sales. It was the fact that these larger systems happened to be in hotels that had all of these other amenities that were sort of competing as entertainment with the movies, that was leading to the lower sales. And so once they understood that, then we actually realized that in fact what they wanted to do was offer even more variety in those hotels, and it paid off. But it was a situation where they again, they didn't really understand what was producing variation in what they thought was the important variable.
Professor, your study with Dr. Michael Real highlights how even in ideal scenarios, managers struggle with causal inference. What does this mean for decision making in real world, less than ideal business environments?
Sure. So, this is our paper is kind of an interesting paper. You could take it as like a glass half full or glass half empty paper, right? And I think the glass half empty is that, there are situations where you're just never going to be able to solve this problem, right? But I actually think that, part of the message for the paper should be this kind of glass half full, which is that in situations where you don't have these kind of confounding common causes that we don't, that you're not observing or not aware of. If that doesn't exist, it turns out that managers can make proper inferences, can make proper decisions, even with very little information. All they need to have information on is the action that they're interested in basically making a policy about. That could be something like the salesperson discounting the car. It could be something like what's the size of the system that we're offering in the pay-per-view movies. But you just need to have information about that variable, sort of the outcome of that variable, and then something maybe about kind of profitability or overall performance. And that's actually sufficient in many, many situations to make decisions, just not always.
In your view, what are some common misconceptions corporate leaders have when trying to establish cause and effect relationship with their organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of misconceptions that I see oftentimes. I think one type of misconception that I see is just around almost like quantity of data, right? Kind of this idea that if we just have more data, that's going to lead us to better decisions. And sometimes that's true. But we might oftentimes want to distinguish between, in sort of research methods, we think about like the reliability of a result and its validity, right? So if we're thinking about like, shooting arrows at a target, right, reliability would be on average, how close are you getting kind of, or how clustered, right, are your arrows? Validity would be on average, are you getting, sort of near the bullseye, right? Are you getting kind of the target that you'd want? And managers, I think, oftentimes kind of confuse these two and think that if they get more data, it's true that that's going to typically get you more reliability, but it may or may not get you more validity. If you're aiming in the wrong place, it doesn't matter how many areas you shoot, you're not going to get any, in the bullseye. And so I think that's, kind of one type of misconception. Another one that I see oftentimes, particularly when I talk with organizations about, say, running experiments, is that they uh, oftentimes don't appreciate the importance of random assignment. So they'll think, well, like, this, like, I think a classic case is where somebody's like, well, yes, we want to do an experiment, but we don't want to experiment on our best customers because we don't want to upset them anyway. And so let's just do the experiment on, these customers who maybe aren't buying as much or who aren't as valuable for us. But then the problem, of course, is that whatever result you get out of that may not be valid for all of your customers, and it really may only be a valid result for your least valuable customers.
Professor, your research highlights experimenting with small-scale changes before full implementation. Can you elaborate on why this is so effective?
Yeah, exactly. So experimentation it's like the gold standard for understanding causality in the academic world, right? So when we want to understand whether or not something's happened, we oftentimes will do a laboratory experiment where we're randomly assigning different groups of people to whatever, kind of behaviors we would like to sort of understand the effects of. We see the same thing. This is exactly like a clinical trial for a drug, right? Where if we want to understand whether or not a drug is working or not, we randomly assign it to individuals that we think are similar. In fact, in the clinical trial setting, we oftentimes are not only trying to randomly assign, we're even trying to blind the people running the study to knowing who is in the treatment group and who is, so who's getting the drug and who's getting the placebo, because we don't want that to kind of introduce some unknown influence into the experiment. It's the same type of thing that makes experimentation valuable in business. And so what experimentation does is, remember, I said that like the problems arise when there's this confounding common cause, when something is influencing both the behavior that we're interested in, potentially changing and the outcome of that behavior. Well, in experiment, what happens is we're now randomly assigning the behavior. So it breaks the connection between that confounding common cause. And now we can actually look at the results of the behavior, and we know that that's a causal result.
What role does transparency, such as openly sharing supplier records or internal reports, play in improving decision-making accuracy?
Yeah, so kind of coming back, so one of the reasons why I kind of mentioned this at the very beginning, part of what makes understanding causal relationships challenging is that we don't know everything, right? There's things that we don't have information on. And the question is, are those things important, right? So a lot of times the things that we don't have information on happen because, maybe they're just outside of our purview. So, thinking about, say, supplier records, if there are things that are happening at a supplier, we don't really observe what's happening like in their factory or in their process. It could be important to our outcomes, but we just don't see it, right? The value of potentially sharing that information is now that's no longer something that's unobserved to us. Now we actually understand what's happening at the supplier, or another way of doing this might be to vertically integrate, right, and do the supply ourselves. Then we sort of see what's happening in those processes, and we can understand how it's affecting our own performance. And so it basically takes something that had been unobserved and now makes it observable for us. And by making it observable, we can now understand oftentimes whether or not it is a confounding cause.
You mentioned corporate culture as a way to compensate for hidden information. How can leaders intentionally shape a culture that supports better decision making?
Yeah, so again, it kind of comes back to the same theme of, what is it that's creating variation in the behavior that we're thinking about changing, right? So a lot of times the behavior that we're thinking about changing is the behavior of employees, right? And one of the challenging things for a manager is the employee might be using their own heuristics, their own rules of thumb for, the decisions they're making. Think about the car salesman example. And the manager just doesn't know what those are. They don't know, what information the person might be reacting to. The way that culture can be really valuable is it makes those rules sort of explicit to the manager, right? So if we're Nordstrom's and we know that our corporate culture is about the customer always being right, and that generates a set of beliefs, a set of kind of rules that we behave by, then the manager can understand, well, okay, so whatever the employee is doing, they're acting under this belief that the customer is always right, and then I can use that to make inferences about, okay, do I want to change their behavior in some way? But again, it solves this problem of the influence being hidden. In this case, not necessarily by making what's hidden observable, but by shifting the influence to something that is observed. In this case, the corporate culture.
Are there specific hiring or training practices that can help companies reduce the impact of hidden variables on decision outcomes?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that we discussed in the paper that we think could be interesting is things like promotion from in, or you could think about like rotational programs where, people that are in training to be manager will go through and work in different functions or different divisions of the organization. We think that those can potentially be really valuable in making people aware of what these hidden variables or what these hidden influences might be as they rise up the ranks. And so then when they become the manager, they aren't hidden to them because they sort of already know what they are. And so absolutely think there's the way in which the HR practices can help to, kind of reduce some of these problems.
Professor, with the increasing availability of data and AI-driven analytics, do you believe companies are getting better at understanding cause and effect, or are they still facing the same fundamental challenges?
Yeah, so this is where maybe our paper becomes a glass half empty paper, right? So, I mean, I think on the positive side, companies really over the last 2 decades, I think, have made massive progress in understanding the value of data. They're collecting more data in more different ways. They're trying to, incorporate systems that make that data available to decision makers. I think those are all good practices. Um, and AI itself is a tricky thing. So, and the reason why AI itself is a tricky thing is, again, it comes back to this idea of, do we understand what is, changing the variable of interest for us or changing the behavior of interest for us? So again, let's think about, that car salesman who is, deciding whether or not to discount. So, what happens in AI, particularly a lot of the recent implementations of AI. So if we're thinking about like large language models, neural nets, these things from the perspective of a manager, they're kind of a black box, right? You put a bunch of data in, it gives you some advice, but you don't really know why it's going from the data to the advice. It turns out that not only does that not solve the inference problem, right? So if the manager can't figure it out without the AI, the AI is not going to solve it for them. They just don't have the right data. Um, Even worse, AI could actually introduce a problem. And the way that it could introduce a problem is, like, imagine now that salesperson is going and entering some data into an AI system. That AI system is telling them, well, you should discount or you shouldn't discount, right? The problem is we don't know what is driving the recommendation from the AI because it's a black box. And because we don't know what's driving it, then the manager actually doesn't know whether or not they should intervene. The AI itself could become a confounding common cause or, kind of a path in this, right? It might be reacting to something that's like the salesperson's private information, like seeing that, for example, the customer, has a different willingness to pay or, different likelihood of purchase, and basing its recommendation on that. But if the manager doesn't understand what the underlying algorithm is, then they don't understand that. They can't make, kind of proper causal inference. So, it's a tricky thing. I think that data analytics are a real positive for companies, but I think that, there's, if people are thinking that there's going to be like an AI that's going to sort of start solving all their business problems, that may be a little overly optimistic.
Professor, how can business schools and management researchers integrate lessons from scientific disciplines to enhance the study of corporate decision making?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. I mean, I think one, a lot of business schools, especially, have already started to do, and that's on the empirical side. Take some of these advances that people have been thinking about in terms of like the replication crisis, or sometimes called the identification revolution. Take some of the understanding of how you do causal estimation and try to, get students to sort of see how that works and appreciate how they could use those techniques to make better use of data. I think there's also another angle, and this has probably made less progress, but one of the really interesting, I think, research streams in the last sort of 10, 15 years in strategy has been something that's been sort of become known as the theory-based view. The basic idea is that, well, let's think about the manager or the strategist or the entrepreneur as being a little bit like a scientist, right? They're coming up with a theory of the world. They can form hypotheses. They can test those hypotheses. They can think about what's the internal logic of their theory. I think there's a lot of value to that. I'd like what we're seeing on the research side is that brings in a lot of what we understand about good scientific practice from the literature on philosophy of science. And people are starting to translate that into some very specific practices that managers can use to help develop better theories and therefore, I think, make better decisions. And so I think those are, kind of twin angles. One is how do we better use data to sort of estimate our kind of relate the causal relations of interest, but also how do we better create better theories so that we understand better the types of decisions that we're interested in making.
Professor, my last question. What advice would you give to business leaders who want to make better decisions in a world of hidden variables and unpredictable consequences?
Yeah. It's one of the things that's like really hard about hidden variables, or what we call hidden variables, is there's, you could think about there's like known unknowns and unknown unknowns, right? And the known unknowns are, okay, you can do things about them. You can try to collect information on them. Maybe you can kind of simulate them out. What's really hard is the unknown unknowns, like what's out there that might be influencing our business that we don't even realize exists, right? And it's not an easy problem to deal with, right? But I do think that one of the things that managers can do systematically is, like, if you're thinking about a policy influencing something, like around maybe how you're doing purchasing, or like around discounting, or around, the example with the pay-per-view movies on the sort of the design of the system. If you're using data to inform your choices, you want to think carefully about what is producing variance in the variable that you're thinking about creating a policy around, right? So if we think about like the pay-per-view movies and the variety of movies that are offered, right? What is it that's influencing that variety, right? So I think managers a lot of times approach this and they just sort of say, well, that's like almost like random, or they're treating it as if it's random, right? And so then we can assume that any relationship between that and something else is causal. But it's worth really, kind of thinking deeply about, well, is that right? Or is there something else that might have led to that variation, right? And that can oftentimes shift something from, let's say, being an unknown unknown to being a known unknown. And once it's a known unknown, then we can start thinking about, well, okay, could we get data on it? Can we see whether or not that might be what's really explaining what's happening in this situation?
Very insightful. Listeners, as we wrap up this insightful conversation, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Olav Sorenson for joining us today. His expertise in entrepreneurship, economic geography, and strategy has provided invaluable perspectives on the complexities of corporate decision making. From his pioneering research on the role of social capital in entrepreneurship to his contributions in leading academic journals, Professor Sorensen has continuously shaped our understanding of how businesses and regions evolve. His work not only bridges the gap between theory and practice, but also empowers organizations and entrepreneurs to navigate uncertainty with greater clarity. Once again, thank you, Professor Olav Sorensen, for sharing your time, wisdom, and thought-provoking insight with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.